Mary Chestnut was one of the most famous women of the 19th century. She was an author. She was the wife of a U.S. senator who resigned his Senate seat when Abraham Lincoln was elected, and he came home to South Carolina and became an aide-de-camp of Confederate President Jefferson Davis. And throughout the war, she kept a diary. And it's one of the most famous accounts of the Civil War. There are about 70,000 books written about the Civil War, and hers is probably one of the three most important, not only for its own literary value, but because she was there. It's source material. It's referenced in almost every historian's book about the Civil War. The book I wrote about Mary Chestnut is a 2-volume book, which for the first time reunites 200 of the photographs that she collected with her diary, which we're certain now was her intention all along. But she gave them to a niece, these photographs, and they were lost. They were lost somewhere in 1930 when her niece died, and they vanished for 80 years. We found them on eBay and bought them at auction and gave them back to the University of South Carolina's Caroliniana Library, where they're now reunited with their manuscripts. And we wrote this book to show that she was so ahead of her time. What she was really creating was not only a written history, but a visual history. And the collection of photographs isn't just all the Southern military heroes. It's the whole panorama of the world that she saw at the time. The crowned heads of Europe, the foreign ministers, the abolitionists, the New York newspaper editors, everyday people. She was really writing an epic like the Iliad or the Odyssey, like Homer's Iliad or Odyssey. And she was creating an epic on all the levels that a classic epic is, which is the destruction of a society, the story of the political intrigue, the war, the everyday life, the music, the poetry, the hymns, the everyday people, and she packed it all into her diary. But we have to remember that she wasn't read until 1900. She called her diaries my treasure, and she kept them throughout the war, and then she came home to a ruined civilization, and she kept on writing, and she revised them. She did 5,000 pages. She did 4 complete revisions. And then she gave them to a school teacher friend of hers in Columbia, who placed them under an armoire for 20 years and then finally decided to publish them. And when they were published first in 1905, every library in the South had a copy. And so her first-hand account of going through the tragedy, the national tragedy of the war, with a woman's perspective and a very enlightened perspective about race relations and human rights, women's rights, has become one of the most popular books ever known about the Civil War. She had a front row seat on all of history. Her family, her husband's family were Union men. They were not in favor of the secession of South Carolina. And she loved her years in Washington, and she loved observing and writing about all of the fascinating people that she met there. But when her husband resigned his Senate seat, she wrote, "Mrs. Chestnut is not at all resigned," and came home, had to leave Washington. And then they were in the thick of it. Her husband helped draft the Confederate Constitution. He was in Richmond as an aide-de-camp of Jefferson Davis. She was one of Verena Davis's closest friends. So she saw all of the politics and the internal conflict of a newly formed nation that was totally unprepared to do what it did, and of course failed. She saw that they had no army, they had no currency, they had no structure, they were completely, they were foolhardy to do this. And she stayed in Richmond in the Spotswood Hotel, where the evenings were filled with the comings and goings of the famous generals and the famous military leaders. And she was constantly writing down everything she heard them say and everything her husband would tell her when he came home. So she could see the inner turmoil that was going on in this Confederacy as well, the fractious relationships between Jefferson Davis and some of his military leaders. Mary Chestnut's sister was my great-great-grandmother. I think that for all of us in the generations thereafter, we're part of a culture, a Southern culture, that are essentially Celtic storytellers. We have a deep connection to the land, a deep fascination and love of stories. And when the Civil War wiped out 50 years of the South and a generation of men, one of the few things that survived was this determined effort to keep family together through letters, communication, holding on to the old family home. And for me, the thing that is fascinating is that I can find in the family letters the spirit of women who so anchored the family life. They were such second-class citizens during the 19th century. A lady wouldn't even have her photograph in the newspaper, except perhaps just a small obituary when she died. But these were the people who held it all together, who kept families together and managed to survive and farm. Some of them were farmers and teachers after the war, even though they'd never worked. So my favorite part of this is handing on to my children and grandchildren, particularly the daughters and granddaughters, this sense of courage and engagement with life that they felt going through so much hardship, and that they've left a story for us to treasure and to add on to.